On behalf of Cura and the School of Theology, we welcome you to the second annual Peter Berger Lecture in the Comparative Study of Religion. I'm Dana Robert, and I'm the Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission here at the BU School of Theology. And here is my colleague, Dr. Robert Hefner, who's the Director of Cura. So we both are welcoming you to this event this evening. This is the second annual Peter Berger Lecture, and we're very delighted to have our friend and person we admire so much, Dr. Peter Berger, Professor Berger, here on the front row. It's much more fun to have a lecture in honor of someone when they're still around to enjoy it. So we're delighted that you could make it here, Peter, and I don't need to introduce Professor Berger because everyone in here should know that he's one of the most famous and important sociologists of the 20th and 21st century. And we're very privileged that he's a professor here at Boston University. Our speaker tonight is Professor Elizabeth Brusco. Dr. Brusco received a BA in anthropology from Boston University. So welcome back.
Thank you.
And a PhD in anthropology from the City University of New York. She conducted field research in Colombia and published a book on the evangelical movement there entitled The Reformation of Machismo. Now I have to speak personally here and say how invaluable and helpful I have found that book and your other work over the years.
Thank you.
I've quoted you often, as have a number of other people here. So it's a privilege to get to welcome you back to BU tonight.
Thank you.
Dr. Brusco has written on gender roles in Colombia and religious persecution there. She joined the faculty at Pacific Lutheran University in 1988 and teaches courses on Latin America, the Pacific Islands, anthropology of religion, kinship and family, linguistics, and anthropological methods. She was also founding chair of the Women's Studies program at Pacific Lutheran University in the early 1990s. Her current research interests include religion and culture in the Pacific Islands and the experiences of new immigrants in the Pacific Northwest. Professor Brusco will address us tonight on the topic Barred from the Pulpit, Absent from the Stage, and Missing in the Analysis, Why We Must Keep Women in the Foreground in Understanding Global Pentecostalism. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Brusco.
Okay then, I think you carried my notes away, but if we'd rather get started, I'd be happy to. Well, thank you for that introduction, and again, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be presenting the Peter Berger Lecture, a tremendous honor. And I was an undergraduate, as Dana mentioned, back in the 1970s here at BU. At that time, protesting the Vietnam War and challenging the establishment occupied more of student consciousness than lectures and classes. And if you had told me then that I would be up here now, I would not have believed you. One shining exception to that, my distraction during those years from my studies, were the seminars I took at BU with the late Eva Hunt. Professor Hunt was an Argentinian trained at Chicago, a symbolic anthropologist who started out with a focus on economy and irrigation systems. Her book, The Transformation of the Hummingbird, brilliantly maps the multivocality of a Zina Kantekin poem. I was in awe as I sat in class and listened to her unravel those layers of meaning, and she was one of my strongest inspirations to pursue the career of anthropology. So thank you for bringing me back here. It's an honor to be the Peter Berger lecturer, and I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the memory of Professor Eva Hunt. My goal for the next hour or so is to comment on the place of gender analysis in the scholarship on the Pentecostal movement. My own ethnographic fieldwork on Pentecostals in Colombia will inform the discussion, and I'll make reference to that as I go along. Preparing these remarks has given me an opportunity to reflect on my own development as a feminist scholar, an anthropologist, and a person who has been concerned about the place of women in global Pentecostalism since the pioneer days, when the field was very small indeed. I'm not sure at what point in aging one begins to be acutely aware of how one's life course intersects with history. I don't think I thought about it too much when I was an undergraduate at BU. When I first started formulating my research project on Colombia, writing a proposal that would allow me to conduct ethnographic fieldwork with evangelicals there, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president. That was 1980. The Sandinistas had overthrown Somoza in Nicaragua, and the CIA was busily involved in supporting the Contra War. Elsewhere in Central America, Rios Montt, an evangelical pastor who was personal friends with the likes of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, had started his brutal military dictatorship in Guatemala. El Salvador was engaged in a bloody civil war, and Archbishop Oscar Romero had been assassinated. 4 Maryknoll nuns and a lay worker had just been murdered in El Salvador by US-backed forces. From the point of view of left-leaning scholars in the US, certainly a majority of anthropologists, the battle lines were clear. The bad guys in these struggles were supported by covert operations in cahoots with influential evangelicals. Moral majority leaders, religious leaders, were wined and dined at the White House. On the ground in Latin America, the challenge to these regimes came from the Catholic-based communities, liberation theology having emerged as a force after the Roman Catholic Church recognized its preferential option for the poor in 1967. All this is by way of saying very few anthropologists, Latin Americanists, and Marxist scholars, among whom I counted myself, were in the mood to talk about evangelicals or Pentecostals. Certainly not in any way other than condemnatory. Not only were Pentecostals or evangelicals agents of imperialism, the legacy of missionary colonialism, collaborating with corrupt regimes, running death squads against thousands of innocent people in Central America. They were purveyors of false consciousness and patriarchy. This leads me to the second timeline. Key texts in feminist anthropology were published in the mid-1970s, and by the time I entered graduate school at the end of that decade, Gail Rubin's suggestion that societies possess a sex-gender system, as well as political, economic, and religious systems, was well recognized. Several main areas of investigation on women and gender emerged by the late 70s. In the context of this talk, I can only provide broad brushstrokes of a much more complex theoretical landscape, but I'll mention 3 areas because it was within these frames that I developed my questions for research on women in Pentecostalism. First was the posited separation of sex from gender, hence biology from destiny. Growing out of the explosive social movement for women's rights in the US, a big question had to do with the universality of the subordination of women. How connected was women's status in society to their biological roles as mothers? The question often transmogrified into one which had an immediate and personal relationship to the scholars who were writing about it. Are women's family roles responsible for keeping them down? Was the question. And just as a side note, this played out very differently amongst African American feminists in the US, and also in Europe, among European feminists and South American feminists, for whom the role of mother was a highly valued and powerful one. And so seeing the role as a source of weakness or oppression made no sense within those cultural frames. Second, how are women and men different, and how are they related in specific societies? What are the sources of women's and men's authority and power? Inherent in that discussion was an awareness of the implication of various modes of production and their changes over time. The argument often went back to Engel's Origin of Private Property in the State and explored the division between public and private and how subsistence responsibilities, work, and access to property and goods are gendered and change in various modes of production over time. A model of gender differentiation proposed by Susan Carroll Rogers was very helpful to me. Very simply, Rogers proposed that men and women in any particular society can be different from each other in a variety of ways, but two in particular. They may be different in a behavioral way, that is, they act out different roles, and Rogers felt this kind was potentially universal. And they may be ideologically differentiated, that is, they see each other as fundamentally different. Each gender has its own perception of the universe, values, and goals within the overarching basic values of the society. Gregory Bateson called this a sex-based ethos. It clearly changes over time and is subject to economic and other historical forces. At times, men and women are more ideologically convergent and at times more divergent. Beyond its theoretical significance, Rogers' 1978 article importantly implied a method of data collection. For my study of Pentecostalism in Colombia, it meant listen to the women. It also meant listen to the men and don't expect these two visions to be identical. So let's turn to where this fits in to the scholarship on gender and Pentecostalism and the study of a religious movement that undeniably involves more than the average amount of gender politics. What would it take to keep women up front? The question has multiple implications, but can be taken quite literally, as it stems from my first experience with Latin American Pentecostalism in the Church of Juan 3:16, John 3:16, in New York City. In the first Pentecostal service I ever attended, and I was a graduate student in anthropology at the time, not a seeker of Pentecostal truths, scores of identically dressed women in dark blue skirts, white blouses, and gold sashes across their chests ran almost the entire service from the floor of the theater-like building, while four men dressed in business suits sat on stage in ornate chairs. Every so often, one of the men would rise to lead a prayer, give a short sermon, but by and large, the praying testimonies, preaching and teaching, speaking in tongues, laying on of hands, and conducting the service in general was taken care of by the women, who never ascended the stage. In fact, it is easier to answer the question, why aren't the women up front literally in the Pentecostal church, than to figure out why women aren't up front analytically in the academic treatment of what is now global Pentecostalism. When I began my work in the Pentecostal movement in Colombia, research on the subject was sparse. To find the women, one had to learn to read between the lines. For example, James Sexton's 1978 publication on the evangelical movement and modernization among the Maya in Guatemala. In the Assemblies of God, which was the largest congregation in the community in Guatemala where he studied, Sexton noted that 63% of the voting members were female. He then proceeds to interview almost exclusively male heads of households. His bias is telling in the language of his conclusion. Quote, Protestants more often work in non-agricultural occupations. They are more often legally married. Their wives are measurably more educated than Catholic wives, and so forth. So we have Protestants, and then we have their wives. But what would the conclusions be, I thought at the time I read Sexton's article, if instead of considering Protestants and their wives, we considered Protestants and their husbands? Not only what would the conclusions be, but what would the questions be? For a newly awakened feminist graduate student in the 1970s, identifying male bias in scholarship was both a necessity and something of an obsession. Certainly, women had often been systematically ignored as subjects when it came to understanding social, political, economic, and cultural systems. the devaluation of women's social and cultural roles by scholars of religion is evident in the application of the marginality thesis to explain women's attraction to Pentecostalism. In this model, women are drawn to Pentecostalism for the same reason other marginal people are, because it simply affords them an opportunity for expression and status not available to them in mainstream society. Marginality explanations, however, assume a center. The decentering that has gone on over the past decade as a result of feminist and postmodern challenges to establish scholarly assumptions seriously erodes the explanatory power of such logic. However, giving women the prominence in the scholarship on Pentecostalism to which they should be entitled, if for no other reason than their sheer numbers within the movement, has not been a straightforward feminist success story of making women visible and overcoming male bias. A feminist arguing that women in conservative Christian groups might be serving their own interests, faced some imposing ancestors. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, often cited as the founding genius of the women's rights movement in 19th century America, said, quote, "The Bible and the church have been the biggest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation," end quote. No less forcefully, Mary Daly, arguably the most important and certainly the most radical feminist theologian of the second wave, stated in her 1968 book, The Church and the Second Sex, quote, "A woman asking for equality in the church would be comparable to a black person's demanding equality in the Ku Klux Klan," end quote. The reason they said these things, of course, is because there is biblical support for women's subordination to men in the family and in society in general, or at least there are scriptural references for those who are seeking divine support for the subordination of women. For example, the letter of Apostle Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 22 to 33, "Wives, be subject to your husband as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church." Very familiar to feminists in religious studies. The 16 million member Southern Baptist Convention amended its statement of beliefs in 1998 to add this phrase, "A woman should submit herself graciously to her husband's leadership, and a husband should provide for, protect, and lead his family." Helen Hardacre, professor of religious studies at Harvard, called fundamentalism the ultimate patriarchal mandate. She states that, quote, "It is little wonder that men are attracted to fundamentalist creeds, but the persuasive power of such creeds for women is much more difficult to comprehend." Now, certainly Southern Baptists are not Pentecostals, or at least not all of them, nor is fundamentalism a synonym for Pentecostalism. Yet, this discourse about the biblical justification for patriarchal dominance is inescapable in contemporary scholarship on gender and Pentecostalism. This brings us to what Bernice Martin has recently called the Pentecostal gender paradox. In fact, the word paradox in the discussion of women in Pentecostalism springs up repeatedly over the last few years. Implicit in the paradox are the questions, why do women convert to Pentecostalism in greater numbers than men, when Pentecostal doctrine and practice are evidently oppressive to women? Why are women often the first to convert and bring husbands and sons in later rather than the other way around? These questions are more easily resolved locally than globally. As feminist scholarship developed and began to utilize a toolkit of methodologies for writing women's worlds, such as life history, personal narrative, and testimony, the problem of the, quote, double disappearance of dominance and othering affecting research on Pentecostal women was addressed. And I believe Susan Harding is responsible for that phrase, a double disappearance of dominance and othering. These new, more grounded approaches are immensely significant for improving understandings of what conservative religious movements do for women in any particular instance. And I would include here Islam and Orthodox Judaism, which has also sort of taken a viewpoint similar to this one. However, when we get beyond the particular, beyond the monograph to the theoretical treatise or comprehensive analysis, it becomes much harder to keep the women in front. Let's look at two influential publications. First, Alan Anderson's 2004 book, An Introduction to Pentecostalism, focuses our attention on the Pentecostal experience in the majority world and laudably underscores its complexity and the backflow influence of world Pentecostal expression on the overall theology and development of the movement. Yet only 2.5 pages toward the end of the book are dedicated directly to a discussion of women and Pentecostalism. Here, Anderson notes that women form the great majority of the church worldwide, but his brief discussion is concerned primarily with women in ministry, rather than the way the experience of conversion and Pentecostal practice is gendered. Citing Cheryl John's work on Pentecostalism as the pedagogy of the oppressed, he implicitly recognizes the potential for challenge to the gender status quo. The fact that spirit baptism and the call of God are the only qualifications for ministry preempted social norms and accepted patterns of ministry, and that's Cheryl Johns speaking again. Yet he concludes this brief section on women with Johns's rather depressing observation that in the US at least, Pentecostalism has been co-opted, has failed to address gender and other forms of cultural oppression, and is now characterized by a male clergy and a high degree of institutionalism. And maybe this is the right place to kind of add this little caveat, which is my apologies to Pentecostal women who are in the pulpit, on the stage, and in the analysis, because I know there are many, and my title kind of excludes them from consideration, but I am very aware of that. It's kind of an extreme statement on my part in order to draw the contrast. You'll see why I make that point in a sec. Published in 2007, Miller and Yamamori's Global Pentecostalism, the New Phase of Christian Social Engagement, also makes an important contribution to our understanding of the movement on a worldwide scale. They coined the term progressive Pentecostalism and detail the social ministries of Pentecostal churches, from emergency relief programs to education, counseling, medical assistance, economic development, and even policy change. Again, here, if you want to find the women, look in the back of the book. Miller and Yamamori dedicate 2 pages to the role of women. They note that women are typically the majority of most congregations, and recap briefly 3 attempts they know of to explain the appeal of Pentecostalism to women. The one they prefer reads like this, and again, in the case of James Sexton, the language is important. For rural women migrating to urban areas, the Pentecostal church is, quote, a liberating institution providing an escape from domestic chores and a relatively egalitarian location in which they can exercise their gifts. Why they would feel that explanation is sufficient to explain the most rapidly expanding movement and religious movement in the world today is unclear, but it is a variation of the old marginality hypothesis. Even less satisfying is their treatment of what they call the patriarchal bargain. And here they're obviously referring to the studies that have been done, including my own, and what Bernice Martin has referred to, in which women are looking to change the behavior of their male partners. They state, women will trade prestige and authority within religious settings for husbands that become domesticated as a result of conversion. That is, men become less abusive at home, give up extramarital affairs, and spend more time raising children. It is unfortunate that they don't elaborate on this scenario, nor cite any of the many studies exploring the impact of conversion on the home. It would be nice to know, too, what prestige and authority women are allegedly giving up to join Pentecostal groups. Finally, a transformation of the male role, including getting men to be less abusive, contribute to childcare, and be faithful in a relationship, has been the hardest challenge facing Western feminists. And if Pentecostal conversion accomplishes this, isn't it worthy of more than a brief note? Throughout Miller and Yamamori's book, the description and analysis of the movement is from the top down. Their concentration on church hierarchy, which privileges the voices of those in formal leadership roles, camouflages the importance of women in Pentecostal churches. Only one of the many congregations they visited around the world was headed by a woman, and that's in Singapore. Yet they note that many of the most exceptional Pentecostal social programs that they studied were founded by women. Rather than examining that fact to shed light on the question of women's attraction to Pentecostalism, they pointedly detached these social entrepreneurs, as they call them, from their gender, instead crediting each individual's creativity and drive. In other words, in their estimation, it's not women who are responsible for these social programs, it's simply exceptional people. Even more importantly, the authority of personal charisma, the inspirational versus institutional quality of leadership in Pentecostal churches, the priesthood of all believers, and the parallel and complementary nature of male and female organizational structures within Pentecostal churches are overlooked by the authors. Both of these new books would have been helped by a recognition of gender as a culturally constituted institution in society like kinship or religion, which systematically articulates with other institutions, as Gail Rubin pointed out in the good old days. Now let me move on to examine how each of the Pentecostal characteristics mentioned above intersects with gender dynamics using case material from my research in Colombia. All of these points build on each other. First, that spiritual authority in Pentecostal churches is accessed through manifestations of charismatic gifts such as speaking in tongues, healing, or prophecy, means that women and men basically have equal access to such authority. Moreover, the playing ground is not quite level because in this instance, it's in women's favor, as many studies have shown that cross-culturally, women have a higher propensity for entering into trance or dissociative states than men do. On the other hand, receptivity to the diffuse power represented by the Holy Spirit is uncharacteristic for Colombian males. The image of male converts with their arms and faces upraised, inviting the Holy Spirit, is extraordinary in that stark contrast to the impenetrable pose of machismo. For women, the spiritual permeability is not dissonant with acceptable female roles. But women receiving these charismatic gifts, for them it's deeply empowering on many levels, and others that witness such transformations in individual women, including their husbands and male partners, cannot help but be impressed. A woman's conversion and display of charismatic gifts may not always be received positively in her household. In many cases, men are threatened and hostile and try to prohibit their wife's involvement in the church. But in some cases, particularly if a man is sick or otherwise debilitated, a woman's newfound authority, her spiritual authority, gives her influence over her husband she formerly didn't have and can result in her leading him also into the church. And I heard this in male testimony quite a bit. Secondly, leadership roles in Pentecostal churches, especially in the fast-growing popular churches outside of the denominational structure, are often the result of inspiration rather than appointment through formal institutional channels. And clearly, within such fluid systems, women have greater opportunity to occupy leadership roles, or perhaps, to put it more accurately, to take on leadership roles at specific points in time. So not formal positions, but leadership roles. Through our own cultural lenses, as Westerners from industrialized, highly bureaucratic states, favoring male leaders with titles and formal positions, such women's leadership may be hard to see. For example, the women running the service from the floor of the theater in the church John 3:16 in New York City mentioned earlier. And in fact, in societies such as Colombia, where a woman's overt dominance or direction over males might be intolerable, there may be a good reason to keep it somewhat obscure. I'll discuss that issue further in a moment when I get back to the Pentecostal paradox. Both of the points above relate directly to the third issue of importance when considering how the specific characteristics of Pentecostalism intersect with gender. And that's the priesthood of all believers. Spiritual authority is not limited to the individual up on the stage, but potentially and hopefully, from the point of view of the church, shared by all of those down in the congregation. However, this characteristic of Pentecostalism takes on heightened importance in Colombia, where the Catholic hierarchy, Roman Catholic hierarchy, has had tremendous dominance over both the spiritual and social dimensions of society. In 1887, the Colombian government signed a formal treaty with the Vatican, resulting in complete church-state integration. The educational system was run by the Catholic Church, and a Catholic baptismal certificate was necessary in order to enroll in school. Pentecostals and other evangelicos were often found themselves forced to baptize their children in the Catholic Church just to get them into school, even though there was a lot of antagonism between the two religious groups. So I'm going to summarize some of that background on Colombia and skip. Just to summarize the importance of the Bible in Colombian society, that the Bible had been outlawed by the Roman Catholic Church on the belief that only the priesthood had the ability to interpret Scripture. And if people, the peasants, the rural country folk, got a hold of the Bible, they were likely to tear it apart and turn the pages into little talismans and use the Bible in inappropriate magical ways. So it wasn't until really after Vatican II that the Bible reading started to be more widespread in Colombia. For Pentecostals, owning a Bible is sort of the first item of commitment. You acquire a Bible, and Bible reading is central. It engenders a kind of reflective, introspective, and analytical quality in people in Colombian Pentecostal practice. And for women, that's often a radical departure from what had been for them before, a kind of passive acceptance of their role in life. The last piece of the puzzle, the parallel and complementary nature of male and female organizational structures within Pentecostal churches, parallel and complementary nature of the male and female organizational structures occupies a noticeable blind spot for many scholars evaluating the position of women in Pentecostalism. For example, in his review of Latin American movements for the Fundamentalism Project, Pablo Diros focuses primarily on the persuasive abilities of the male authority figure, be he the local pastor or the mass evangelist, and hence misses the diverse contributions of women who make up the majority of the congregation. The core of evangelizing efforts in Colombia are the cultos a domicilio, that means services in the home. Every church, in addition to frequent services and special meetings held in the temple, has a list of multiple weekly home services. It is usually the case that members, almost always women, volunteer their homes for these meetings and take on the responsibility of leading the prayer, Bible reading, and hymn singing. This technique of evangelization is a brilliant use of the primary resources available to the church: the commitment of female members, their interpersonal skills in a traditional context, and their personal networks of kin and friends. A female preacher stresses the compatibility of evangelization with a Colombian woman's traditional role. She says, "The Bible says to go out to the whole world and preach the gospel. Those of us who have homes and children, it's very difficult for us to go all over the world. But we can give the message to our neighbors, to our families, to our friends, to our block. We have a lot of people to give it to." In fact, the cultos a domicilio are much more important in both conversion and sustaining new converts than the much more visible crusades, mass open-air rallies, usually led by a famous preacher, which are associated with worldwide Pentecostal expansion. Big crusades, in fact, have not had much success in Colombia, whereas the cultos a domicilio are personal, intimate, and private. The open-air rallies are impersonal, anonymous, and public. There is no basis for a Colombian woman's involvement in such activity, and the concept is likely to seem foreign to her. But it is not only in the cultos de domicilio that we see the parallel gender structure in Pentecostal churches in Colombia. Most successful evangelical churches in Colombia have active women's organizations. All of the evangelical churches I studied had women's organizations, and it is often the case that the Confraternidad de Damas took on the lion's share of responsibility for the church, including evangelization campaigns, fundraising, social welfare work, and furnishing, maintaining, and decorating the church. Confraternidad de Damas someone pointed out to me that means brotherhood of ladies. Special weekly services for women are held by many churches and often as well attended as the Sunday services. In churches that do not allow women to be pastors, and of course, again, some do, the role of the pastor's wife is strikingly important, and in many ways her influence can be equal to that of her husband. She is, in a sense, and sometimes formally, co-pastor. Men without wives willing to take on an active leadership role in the church are rarely successful in Colombian Pentecostal churches. So that idea of a pastoral couple is really, really important, both as a role model and actively. To return now to a consideration of gender in the current scholarship on global Pentecostalism, I would argue that if we want to know why there's an explosion of Pentecostalism around the world, we need to take seriously the question, why is it that women convert? And we need to follow the question with another one. How does women's presence in the church transform it? Does it further a feminine ethos in Pentecostal worship? Are the social ministries developed by Pentecostal congregations often likely to be addressed specifically to women's needs? Bernice Martin, in her excellent review of gendered Pentecostalism in the Blackwell Companion in 2001, writes about blinkering paradigms that need to be overcome in the study of women in Pentecostalism. At the level of macro theory, neither Weberian variations on the Protestant ethic or Marxist arguments about the way religion mystifies class relations are helpful in parting the cloud covering women in Pentecostalism. I would argue that we need to reject once and for all the victimization hypothesis and to put to rest the notion that Pentecostal women are victims of false consciousness. It is also high time to get beyond the marginality explanation. If we allow women both value and agency, we can begin to see conversion as stemming in part from a linked set of processes that renegotiate gender and family relationships and personal identity, especially in climates of crisis. What would it take to keep the women up front? Some have suggested that the potential of Pentecostalism to improve women's lives is precisely because women are not up front. Bernice Martin put it this way: it seems to be that a substantive shift toward greater equality will be tolerated as long as women are not seen to be publicly exercising formal authority over men. I would add that an uncritical use of the term patriarchy in many analyses of gender and Pentecostalism obscures the culturally specific dynamic of the sex-gender system in any locale. For example, I have written about the difference between patriarchy and machismo in Colombia. Both are forms of male dominance, but with radically different implications for women. Although machismo has ramifications for the domestic realm, it does not stipulate the content of any key relationships within the family, except by default. Its striking characteristic is that it is a non-domestic, one might almost say anti-domestic role. La mujer es de la casa y el hombre de la calle. Woman is of the house and man is of the street, is a statement made in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America. Machismo often entails domestic abdication, that is, the lack of involvement of men in their families and homes. This abdication can run the gamut from the man whose work and social life all take place outside of the home to men who abandon their wives and children. One study identified Colombia as having 31% of the households being female-headed. The culturally specific dynamic of the sex-gender system in Colombia must be taken into account in building any explanations of why people choose to convert to Pentecostalism. Machismo, as an aspect of masculine behavior and identity in Colombia, is best understood as a transitional role, reflecting the enormous social change, including proletarianization and political and economic insecurity in Latin American society. Historical changes in the mode of production matter too, as the peasant household of the past, which formed a domestic economy from production to consumption, has largely been replaced by a cash economy and female dependency on a male wage earner. When men and women begin to occupy separate spheres, their values diverge, getting back to Susan Carol Rogers' model. Men consume their paychecks in the public world of the bars and spend their earnings on things that mark their status in the male world. Women are left hoping to be able to capture a portion of what is left to support the household, the children, and themselves. For the poorest sector of Colombian society, the situation can turn desperate for both men and women. Yet even for middle-class women, or what in Colombia is referred to as the clase profesional, a woman's loss of access to a portion of her husband's earnings can be devastating for her and her children. Why do women convert? Why do they join evangelical churches in Colombia? For many reasons, as evidenced in personal testimonies. For healing, for spiritual fulfillment, and because the evangelical churches provide an accepting and supporting community of fellow believers for those dislocated by violence and migration. But I have argued that importantly for Colombian women, the evangelical churches effectively address the problems resulting from machismo. The churches provide a template for re-articulating men and women, redirecting back into the family and revaluing the domestic realm. In this context, the perils of patriarchy are far from consideration. And how am I doing on time? Let me wrap it up. Anthropologist Laila Abueluchat, in a piece published shortly after 9/11, outlines the ethnocentrism inherent in the notion that Muslim women in Afghanistan needed to be saved from their oppression by American military intervention. She writes that it is wrong to see history simplistically in terms of a putative opposition between Islam and the West, as well as strategically dangerous to accept the cultural opposition between Islam and the West, between fundamentalism and feminism. She asks that we be aware of differences and respectful of other paths toward change. And although drawn from a substantially different cultural and religious context, she raises some pertinent questions. Perhaps liberation, in the sense that the Western women's movement has used this word, is not something for which all women everywhere strive. Might other desires be more meaningful for different groups of people? Abueluchat asks. Living in close families, living in a godly way, living without war. She notes that no woman she has ever met in 20 years of fieldwork in Egypt has ever expressed envy for American women, who they see as bereft of community, vulnerable to sexual violence and social anomie, driven by individual success rather than morality, or strangely disrespectful of God. Abueluchat's points are important, both that we recognize our own ethnocentrism when considering women's lives elsewhere, and that we do not resign ourselves only to a radical cultural relativism, accepting anything that happens to women anywhere simply because it is their culture. And that's the thorny thing that needs to be addressed, and I have to admit I don't have an answer for that, so please don't ask me. Still, a recognition that there are other paths towards change, other approaches to a good life, and other value systems is a critical starting point in understanding the growth of Pentecostalism on a global scale. And now to conclude, I recently stumbled upon a new book on the feminization of poverty in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The author, Sylvia Chant, is a development geographer at the London School of Economics. Chant meticulously critiques existing models and quantitative measures of the relationship between gender, generation, and poverty in 3 locales, the Gambia, the Philippines, and Costa Rica. She also conducted extensive qualitative surveys in each area. Chant concludes that in order to understand the persistent burden of poverty faced disproportionately by women around the world, we need a broader perspective, one that shifts the focus from incomes to inputs, and focuses not on the feminization of poverty per se, but rather the feminization of responsibility and obligation. Her data show that there is a growing unevenness in gendered contributions to household survival. Chant's conclusions are exceptionally pertinent to understanding the spread of Pentecostalism globally. In my work on Pentecostal conversion in Colombia, I called this pattern male domestic abdication, and it is precisely the problem which Pentecostalism addresses, both tacitly and overtly, and in many cases corrects. Any consideration of Pentecostalism's modernizing effects is incomplete without considering the social relationship between the sexes, what Joan Kelly has called a fundamental category of historical thought. In human society, both historically and in the contemporary world, the primary locus of interaction between the sexes has been the household, and it follows that the powerful family orientation and the gender balancing ideologies of Pentecostalism would be welcome refuge in what Chant calls the feminization of survival. Finally, does Pentecostalism at all times and all places have the same gender dynamic? I wouldn't expect it to, and that is why contextualization is so important. Throughout Latin America, however, we see common characteristics of gender systems, household and family structures, migration patterns, and political economic formations that have an impact on the gendered Pentecostal experience. These include sex segregation, especially in the context of rural-urban migration, a reduction in emphasis on the wider kin group in favor of the nuclear family, disarticulation of men and women in households due to a transition from agriculture to wage labor, increasing female dependency on male wage earners, a devaluation of the private realm, and a tendency towards domestic abdication and family abandonment on the part of men. Women suffer from a lack of correspondence between their own and male values, and when both husbands and wives convert to Pentecostalism, things improve. And there is some evidence that this pattern may extend beyond Latin America. The authors of a 2007 study on Pentecostalism and gender in Mozambique noted that the increasing economic inequality between men and women in that country resulting from neoliberal reforms coincides with the flood of women into Pentecostal churches, and that when their husbands also convert, tensions within the households are ameliorated. The fine analysis by 3 male researchers, Pfeiffer, Gimbelshare, and Augusto, this is published in American Anthropologist, is a significant illustration of how the importance of gender to understanding Pentecostal conversion is not, and should not be, solely the purview and responsibility of female researchers. Studies by Cucciari, Burdick, Chestnut also illustrate this point. Recently, a wonderful book by David Smild, 2007, Reason to Believe, about Venezuelan men converting to Pentecostalism. Terrific work, ethnographic work that includes gender fundamentally in the analysis, even though the focus is almost entirely on men. David Stoll recognized the importance of gender in his groundbreaking book, Is Latin America Turning Protestant? When I mentioned these conclusions, a lot of times people said, but why would men convert? Behind this question is an assumption that the behaviors and standards of machismo and other male roles, maybe, are somehow desirable or advantageous for men. In fact, machismo is a very difficult and perilous kind of masculine role, often accompanied by pain and violence. It cannot be assumed that the majority of men are cut out for this lifestyle, and certainly many welcome an alternative. Further, machista culture, with its premium on individual independence and physical prowess, makes no provision for illness, and in fact, physical disability is anathema to it. When a man gets sick, he withdraws from his usual activities and becomes more vulnerable to the influence of his wife, and I've mentioned this before. I'm heartened by the directions that the analysis of women in Pentecostalism have taken over the past 3 decades. I look forward to an increasing number of contextualized case studies which will help us to understand the particularity of the Pentecostal experience for women. And I hope to see these understandings built into the very foundations of our analysis of the movement on a global scale. Finally, I.M. Lewis has noted that, quote, once they have shown what for secular ends is done in the name of religion, some anthropologists naively suppose that nothing more remains to be said, end quote. This means that we leave relatively unexplained the, quote, characteristic mystical aspects which distinguish the religious from the secular and fail completely to account for the rich diversity of religious concepts and beliefs. My approach to the topic of Pentecostalism tends to focus on mundane affairs, individual strategies, and interests. This in no way means to slight the passionate emotion and the fervent faith that are the true meaning of Pentecostalism to the followers of that path. Thank you very much.